I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, on the 80th International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we report on an operation in Kursk Oblast last week that apparently saw a large number of Russian troops lured into a trap. And we look at the literally unbelievable election win for Lukashenko in Belarus, returned to power with, we are expected to believe, 87% of the vote.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 27th of January, 2 years and 332 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley. Later, we have a pre-recorded interview Francis did with Shashank Yoshi, defence editor at The Economist. But first, I started with the latest news from the battlefronts of Europe. Let's go over the weekend, it being a Monday. See, I'm good like that. Saturday, all 61 drones fired at Ukraine overnight Friday, Saturday failed in their objective. That would have been a nice birthday present for President Zelensky on Saturday. 46 were shot down, 15 others brought down by electronic warfare or otherwise lost. Russia also fired 2 Kh-59 missiles. They were brought down, one by Ukraine's naval forces as it was heading towards port facilities in the Odessa region. Also on Saturday, Ukraine's commander in Kursk region said that Russia had launched 14 glide bombs against positions in the area. Now, staying in Russia, and the most notable news of Saturday, the oil refinery at Kursk Oblast of Russia was hit again, the second time in 3 nights. Now, aside from the effect on fuel supplies that will undoubtedly have, I think it also shows the paucity of Russian air defence systems if they can't protect all these sites that have been repeatedly struck. However, on the ground inside Ukraine, the only real ground move of the weekend, Velika Novosilka was finally overtaken by Russian forces. We've been expecting that for some time, but it looks like it has finally happened. I'll mention a little bit more on that in a moment. Now, finally on Saturday, I'll point you to an article in Forbes magazine. We'll put the link in the episode notes for today. Written by freelance journalist David Axe. He writes for us quite often. He relates an operation by Ukraine's 255th Assault Battalion around the end of last week sometime, we think maybe Thursday, but not exactly sure, in Kursk Oblast, when that battalion supposedly lured a large Russian force into a trap. This is around the town of Sverdlikovo, that's about 20 k's northwest of Sudzha. The Ukrainian troops coordinated their withdrawal from a planned withdrawal from a position. Russian forces moved into that site. They were too bunched up. Now, as we know, they used mass infantry attacks, so there were a greater number of Russian infantry, we think, than the Ukrainians that had departed. So they were all bunched up, moved into a small position, and then were hit by cluster munitions from a pre-planned HIMARS fire mission, we are told. Now, the battalion put out a statement afterwards, said the strike destroyed a significant part of the enemy's manpower, and our groups returned to complete the clearing of the territory. Now, the article says that Russia's tactics, which, as we know, pretty much consists of just advancing open ground in large numbers, the so-called meat assaults. The article says that accounts for the very high casualty figures that Russia and North Korea have been taking in the nearly 6 months since Ukrainian troops have held Russian territory. The 255th Assault Battalion said it's not often that we can reveal the details of such operations, but this time we managed to show how coordination, tactics and modern weapons work in the hands of the armed forces of Ukraine. And just on that, I note there's some footage going around today, you might see it, related to barbed wire. Now, a very basic part of the infanteer's arsenal, but, barbed wire, as we can all pretty much imagine, it can be absolutely terminal for a ground-based assault. We saw a couple of weeks ago some improvised Ukrainian engineering vehicles that seem to have been modified for the rapid deployment of barbed wire. And then there's footage I've seen today of Russian soldiers stuck in such wire and then hit by FPVs. Now, it is very basic, but if you use barbed wire as an infanteer and I wasn't an infanteer, so I'm on the edge of my jigsaw. People know a lot more about this than me. But using folds in the ground, if you're assaulting at ground level and you haven't got eyes up to see what's over that next little ridge in the ground, if you suddenly come up against barbed wire, then you're stuffed. If you don't have the breaching tools, it takes ages to get through it, and often that is a prime way of bunching up the enemy for subsequent attack. It is crude but effective, a soldier's answer to a tactical problem. Anyway, on with the news. Sunday, another grim statistic. But on Sunday, Russia passed the 40,000 casualties mark. 40,000 casualties in January this year alone. That is the fourth worst month for Russia in terms of casualties since the full-scale invasion began. And there's still, obviously, a few days left of January. On Sunday, another 72 drones were fired at Ukraine. Overnight, Saturday, Sunday, only 59 brought down. And 6 glide bombs were used to hit Beryslav. That's a town about 40 k's upstream from Kherson City. It's in Kherson Oblast, just upstream from the city itself. A hospital was hit there. I haven't seen any reports of deaths, but there were certainly injuries. Also on Sunday, Ukraine's general staff said a strike in Oryol Oblast of Russia, that's the next oblast north of Kursk, was hit again, destroying depots of what they say was thermobaric warheads and drones. They put out a statement saying that 200 Shahed drones, quote, will no longer be used against our country. Now, also on Sunday, Krytsia Group of Forces spokesperson Major Viktor Trebanov said that Russian forces had not occupied all of Velika Novosilka, per the reports from the day before, and said that Ukrainian forces maintain positions in the settlement. Now, I think that is wishful thinking. I think it might, those words might be literally true. Ukrainian forces maintain positions, but analysis by the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, they're saying today that nearly 90% of the town is in Russian hands. So I think that we can say the town has fallen to Russia. Sunday also saw President Zelensky appoint Major General Mikhailo Drapachy, who is commander of the ground forces of Ukraine. He's also going to head up the Krytsia Group, that sort of primarily focus on that in the Donbass, around that area, the area of most intense activity at the moment. So in Sunday's evening address, President Zelensky said, "Today I ordered a strengthening of the command structure of our forces in the Donetsk region." Although I note that General Drapachy is going to continue both roles. He's going to lead the Krytsia Group in the Donbass, and he's going to still be the commander of the ground forces of Ukraine. And I just question whether or not that's the best thing to do, to give two massive roles to one busy person. Anyway, onwards. Monday. Last night, 8 Russian drones hit Ukraine out of 104 fired across 10 oblasts in the country. Ukraine also launched an aerial attack, mainly drones, on Russia. Moscow says it shot down aerial drones over Voronezh, Belgorod, Kursk and Oryol oblasts. They are all bordering or very near Ukraine. However, there are also images on social media today that something hit and caused a very large explosion in Tver Oblast. That is to the northwest of Moscow, but no mention what it was from either side. Overnight, Russian attacks killed civilians in Ukraine, in Kherson, Donetsk and Kharkiv oblasts. Now, in other related news over the weekend, Swedish authorities have seized a ship over what they say is, quote, aggravated sabotage of an undersea fibre optic cable linking Latvia with a strategically important island belonging to Sweden. Damage to the cable, which links the Latvian town of Ventspils with the island of Gotland, was probably caused by external influence, according to Evika Selina, Latvian Prime Minister. Now, numerous vessels, it's a very busy piece of water, numerous vessels passed the broken cable on Sunday. Data from the Marine Traffic Service shows us. One such ship, the Malta flag bulk carrier Vejen, was closely followed by a Swedish Coast Guard vessel. The two were last seen heading towards southern Swedish coastline. It's not immediately clear if the Vejen, which supposedly went over the area of the incident at 0045 GMT, so London time, just after midnight on Sunday, London time, if that's subject to the investigation, but I think they're certainly going to have a couple of questions to answer. Now, this comes just days after Russia accused NATO of carrying out abuses, their word, abuses in the Baltic Sea under the guise of the recently announced patrol mission Baltic Sentry. Now, You may remember Baltic Sentry started late December. That's NATO's operation in the area to boost its presence after a number of recent incidents. It was specifically launched after Finnish police seized a tanker carrying Russian oil last month, which they suspected had damaged the Finnish-Estonian S-Link 2 power line and 4 telecoms cables by dragging its anchor across the seabed. So, if there's any abuse here, I would look at those accidentally dragging their anchors rather than those trying to stop such things happening. Anyway, responding to the latest damage, a NATO spokesperson said NATO ships and aircraft are working together with national resources from the Baltic Sea countries to investigate and, if necessary, take action. I note also that the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, announced an operation to do stuff, trying to keep an eye on undersea infrastructure in the Baltic Sea. I wonder how they're working together, where the coord is between NATO and JEF. And then just finally for me, our friend and colleague James Kilner written a report that's in today in the paper and online. You'll find it. He says Israel is considering sending Soviet and Russian-made weapons captured in Lebanon to Ukraine, and there are signs that such transfers may already be underway. He says Israeli officials reportedly met with Ukrainian diplomats on Tuesday last week to discuss a weapons transfer, and since then a number of US military cargo planes have been tracked flying from Israel to an airbase in eastern Poland. Now, James notes that the Two Majors site, that's a pro-Russia military blog on Telegram, speaking to its 1.2 million subscribers yesterday, said there are signs that Israel has begun supplying Ukraine with Soviet and Russian-made weapons. It then posted photos of dozens of shoulder-mounted missiles, as well as a couple of screen grabs of a US military plane flying from Ramstein Air Base in Germany to the Hatzarim Air Base in Israel and then back to Rzeszów in southeast Poland. That's the main air base from which we think weapon supplies are sort of going in to Ukraine. Now, that comes after Ukrainian embassy thanked Sharon Haskell, that's Israel's deputy foreign minister, for asking the Israeli parliament to approve the sending of captured weapons to Ukraine. Ukrainian embassy said in a statement, it is noted that this initiative would be an important step in recognising the common threats facing both countries. The Ukrainian side expressed hopes for a positive solution to this issue. The weapons transfer deal was said to have been a private proposal initiative by Ms. Haskell, according to the Jerusalem Post. And as we reported last week, you may remember President Zelensky met with his Israeli counterpart Isaac Herzog in Davos. At the time, it was, quote, to discuss important issues related to the cooperation between Ukraine and Israel. Israel, since the full-scale invasion, has been pretty neutral against Russia, but has become more aligned with Ukraine as ties between Moscow and Iran have deepened. So that was an interesting development. Right, OK, I'll take a pause there. Before I turn to Francis, just a question for everyone listening. What did you get up to? What did you get up to on Saturday? I spent the day on Bisley Ranges, blatting targets with a Dragunov and AR-15 assault rifle, 2 centimetre grouping at 100 metres. Still got the magic. Francis, what were you doing on Saturday, and what were you wearing?
I knew you were going to throw me in the deep end on this, right? I was at a stag do on Saturday, and yes, I was dressed as Ken from Barbie, okay? Let's get it out of the way, otherwise it's going to be being drip, drip, drip throughout the episode, so I'm just going to take that image, and then I can start on the updates. Are we happy, Dom?
Well, when you say take that image, I'll be delighted to. But anyway, I think you better go on with the updates, yeah.
Yeah, right. So last week, we focused on the evolving American position on the war following Trump's inauguration, with both the optimists and the pessimists having ample ammunition. I want to start today, though, with what Russia is saying on the subject of negotiations and how it has been shaped by the events of recent days. We spoke on Friday about the concern in Moscow that Trump recognises Russia's economy is fraying and could be brought to its knees were certain initiatives adopted. Perhaps thanks to this, it would seem the Kremlin is pitching itself publicly as being more open to talks, though just how meaningful those talks would entirely depend on whether it thinks delaying talks helps or hinders their objectives. Ostensibly, Putin claims he's ready, telling reporters as such after our broadcast on Friday. He said, regarding negotiations, we have always said, and I want to emphasise this again, that we are ready for talks on the Ukrainian issue. Then listen to this next bit. He said, if Trump's 2020 victory hadn't been stolen, there might not have been a crisis in Ukraine, claiming the US administration maintains a pragmatic and trusting relationship with him. So there you have it, the warm words for President Trump, the pitch to appear reasonable and not responsible for the events of the past 3 years, that tonal shift, all to be expected. It seemed unlikely Putin would reject talks outright, but just because talks are on the table does not mean that what we end up with will be talks in good faith, and that is very important to bear in mind as we enter this next phase. The fears for Kyiv and for Ukraine are that the US and Russia will try and strike a deal over the heads of everyone else. The consequence, of course, of Europe's failure to be a key defensive player with a consistent posture. But if Trump wants a victory, which we understand he does after the fiasco of Biden's early Afghanistan withdrawal and its damage for US prestige, then that is irreconcilable with Moscow's objectives, which are far bigger than territory and would see the end of a sovereign, secure Ukraine. That would undeniably be a defeat for the United States and for the West as a whole. Now, that is why President Zelensky has said his country's allies should try and work towards determining a format for any upcoming peace talks with Russia, and that Kyiv must be involved in those negotiations. That has always been the traditional line from Ukraine's allies, that no deal would be struck without the acceptance of Kyiv, but we are in different times now. Now, as you'll know, one of the points of criticism of Kyiv from Washington is around mobilization. And over the past few months, Ukraine has increasingly been under pressure from its Western allies to start mobilizing young men under the age of 25. This came after the mobilization law that was passed in April did not deliver the expected number of recruits, something we've spoken about at length in the past few months. So far, President Zelensky has refused to budge on this. Part of the reason is demographic fears. Sacrificing young men en masse in a prolonged conflict risks condemning Ukraine, so the argument goes, to an even bleaker future where demographic decline undermines its ability to rebuild economically, socially, politically. And an interesting contribution to this discussion was published in AlJazeera at the end of last week, which has stirred some controversy. It's called "Why is Ukraine Struggling to Mobilise its Citizens to Fight?" And its authors argue that the social contract between state and citizen in Ukraine is weaker than many other Western democracies appreciate. To quote from the piece, it says, "In the 1990s, as part of the slow dismantling of the Soviet past, state-citizen relations were reduced to the following. The state won't help you, but in return, the state won't harm you either. The war put the already fragile social contract to the test. All of a sudden, a state that had hardly been present in Ukrainians' lives demanded that they sacrifice themselves for its survival." They go on to argue that this contract, in their perspective, is fraying, hence the failures around mobilisation, and why Ukraine cannot sustain lowering the age yet further. I should add that some of the statements about Ukrainian attitudes towards the war in the piece, I think, are over-generalised, but it is an interesting read, and we'll link to it in the show notes. The reason I underscore this is, whatever one's views on the social contract aspect, this issue remains of paramount importance for Kyiv, not only in terms of sustaining the war effort, but also in persuading other powers with different histories around conscription and waging war to continue to support it. Now, another post-Soviet state, of course, is Belarus. And as flagged on Friday, the presidential election did take place, with Alexander Lukashenko winning his 7th term as president after an extraordinary 86.8% of the vote turned out for him. A figure so extraordinary that, of course, it has inevitably led to many leaders across Europe rightfully declaring it as a sham. Few leaders even chose to comment on it, to be honest, and those who did condemned it in the strongest possible terms, including Kaja Kallas. And if I can... Oh, hang on, wait a minute. Somebody has praised it, Vladimir Putin of Russia. He says, I congratulate President Lukashenko on his convincing victory in the elections, that's one word for it, clearly demonstrating his high political authority as well as the unquestionable support of the population for the course that Belarus is following. Well, that is a course, of course, which in the eyes of many is essentially steered by Moscow, so no surprises there. And that brings me on to the final subject of my segment today, which is Holocaust Memorial Day, where Russian officials are once again not being invited to Poland for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz because of their actions in Europe. To quote the director of the Auschwitz Museum, this is the anniversary of liberation. We remember the victims, but we also celebrate freedom. It is hard to imagine the presence of Russia, which clearly does not understand the value of freedom. As we've discussed before, commemoration of the Holocaust in Russia is complex and ever-evolving. Steve Rosenberg of the BBC has written an excellent piece on this today, focusing in on the new memorial on the edge of St. Petersburg, not to the millions of Jews who lost their lives, but to Soviet civilians who fell victim to the Nazi genocide. As Steve writes, I listened to a tour guide as she tells a group of schoolchildren about the Treblinka extermination camp. There the Nazis murdered up to 900,000 Jews. She says Treblinka was a death camp where a large number of people were killed in gas chambers. She does not specify that most of the victims were Jews. Putin unveiled this monument last year on the 27th of January, a date with a double historical significance for Russia. On this day in 1944, Soviet forces broke the almost 900-day siege of Leningrad. Exactly 1 year later, the Red Army entered the gates of Auschwitz, and it liberated those who were there. That date was later declared International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But when Putin opened the memorial to Soviet civilians, he spoke not of the Holocaust, but of the genocide of the Soviet people. He argued that the Nazis' aim had been to, quote, seize our country's rich natural resources and territories, as well as to exterminate the majority of its citizens. In Russia today, there is a discernible shift in focus away from the Holocaust to how the Soviet people as a whole, including Russians, suffered in World War II. Now, we'll add a link in the show notes to those who want to look more into that issue and that article by Steve Rosenberg at the BBC. I think the answer to that conundrum as to why Putin does this is obvious. It strengthens his regime at a time when it's waging its bloodiest war since the Second World War. For the Kremlin, even the Holocaust is another weapon it can use to tighten its grip. And with that in mind, and the many crimes Russia has committed over the past 3 years, I'll end with this statement published by the museum at Auschwitz. Auschwitz was at the end of a long process. We must remember that it did not start from gas chambers. This hatred was gradually developed by humans, from ideas, words, stereotypes and prejudice through legal exclusion, dehumanization and escalating violence to systematic and industrial murder. Auschwitz took time. Lest we forget, Dom.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I'm going to continue, if I may, those themes, a critique of Russian society you raised just there, and the comments on that AlJazeera article about the social contract between the self and the state. Because I note, I've been doing some maths, and from today, or the distance between the Russian Revolution and today, it very neatly splits into thirds. So 2/3 of that, 72 years, was the Soviet Union, collapsed in 1989. Said it was going to, I don't know how long they planned to last for, but it only lasted, for all the talk and the books and the history of the Soviet Union, it only lasted 72 years, something I'm sure the Roman Empire would thumb its nose at. But 72 years, that was 2/3 of the time between then and now. The remaining third was the post-Soviet chaos and corruption leading to where we are today. So that was 36 years, exactly. Okay, now Putin's not been in power for all of those 36 years. But in terms of thinking about what's happened over those two periods, it is noteworthy, I think, that the current climate of aggression, stagnation of Russia as a country, as a society, an economy, and a national lack of confidence, basically, has existed for half the time the Soviet Union was here. So it's actually a very sizable chunk. So my question to you, please, as a historian, what happened? What the hell happened over this period of history? Where does this Russian delight in victim status, you mentioned there about Putin's comments about the Holocaust and the genocide of the Soviet people, where does that delight in victim status come from? And after the well-documented and memorised in the country privations and barbarism of life in the Soviet Union, why do so many people in Russia look back at that time with affection? Any ideas, Francis?
This is a really complex question, Dom, and it's one that I think would take hours to even try and offer a satisfactory answer. But I think just on the victim status point, first of all, I think it's a victim status which comes from a place of insecurity, which many countries felt at the end of the 20th century after they had experienced profound transformations, particularly with regard to their own status in the world. The Soviet Union, of course, ended the 20th century, and Russia being the core part of that, as being the defeated party in many ways, and thereby victim status becomes rooted to insecurity, and thereby those two things tend to go hand in hand. I think it's also worth very much underscoring that victim status comes with great power. And I think everything here has to be tied to who benefits from this. And if you look at the way that Putin has used that victim status, it's not just a sort of victim status of, and it ends there, with tears. It's a victim status that is then used to rally anger and used to rally an idea about the need to essentially get revenge on the West, and also get revenge, of course, on those territories that it lost. And indeed, it is Ukraine, I think, which is bearing the brunt of that at the moment. So it is not a fetishization of suffering alone. I think as well, if you're talking specifically about the collapse of the Soviet Union and why some people look back on the Soviet period more broadly with affection, it is worth remembering the chaos that was the end of the Soviet Union and the way in which, democracy, yes, was tried in, and I use it in a loose term, was tried, but it did not bring prosperity. And thereby what people really wanted was stability and the ability to be able to feed their families. And the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union were the opposite of that. It was a time of immense challenge. And I think really many people began to think, well, at least however bad the Soviet period was, at least we knew where we stood. Whilst in the 1990s, the early 90s at least, it was a period really where the erratic leadership offered by Yeltsin, his reliance on emergency powers, his undemocratic actions, and the constitutional crisis in 1993, all of this played a role of people just saying, God, anything's better than this. I think we tend to forget that we take democracy for granted as something that we see its positive effects on our lives. But if you imagine centuries of history where you haven't seen the positive impacts of democracy because you've never had it, and when you have your first taste of it, for a few fragile years, it's chaos. That appeal is not there so starkly and so clearly. Now, it's slightly different in the post-Soviet territories that became part of the West, or indeed became part later of the European Union, because, of course, they had, in their perception, suffered under an imperialism from the centre, from Russia. So that's where the nuance comes in, is that they saw, one could argue, the value of democracy more, or at least of freedom more, in its different guises, because they saw themselves as being oppressed. Whereas Russia and Russians did not to the same extent, one would argue. Naturally, Dom, I'm having to talk in generalisations here because this is so complicated. And I know that some historians of very specific periods will be going, hang on a minute, what about in 1984 or something like that? But I'm talking in generalisations here. I think also as well, we sometimes tend to talk about the actions of Putin and the kleptocracy as if they were just riding the tide of history. And that underscores the violence and manipulation of the Russian population that they carried out in that period. They used, as I say, terrorist activities. They deployed almost every tool that one can find in Machiavelli's The Prince in order to try and climb the greasy pole to the top, and they succeeded in doing so. And so I think it is important to give them the moral responsibility for destroying democracy as well. It didn't just naturally happen. A collective effort was made by a small group of people who profited from the end of the Soviet Union and profited by the collapse of the democratic system. And we're still living with the after effects of that today. But if you're looking for a broader examination of the Russian cultural consciousness, Dom, then I think it's something that we've, of course, touched on in many previous episodes in its different aspects, but it runs very, very deep indeed. And some of these issues are ones that will take a very long time to be solved because, unfortunately, we tend to take for granted, as I alluded to earlier on, when we look at the Ukrainian history. Western countries have very different understandings of the relationship between the individual and the state. And in Britain, in America, in many European countries, that is a strong bond that has been built and embedded with trust over a long period of time. But if you imagine societies where that is not present, where your priority becomes looking after your family and a kind of acquiescence to fate and just an attempt not to interact with the state as much, you're certainly not looking to it for guidance or support, and you're only ever really acting on it based on what it tells you to do, then that relationship is very, very different. And so, as ever, Dom, history shapes these things so profoundly, and that's why history is so important.
Yes, thank you, Francis. I'm always fascinated by how Putin and others reach back into history for the examples that suit their argument. But there are so many. I mean, we've seen it today on Holocaust Memorial Day as he reaches back to refer to that as a Soviet genocide. You know, he's twisting it for his own ends. Of course, we keep getting the spectre of Iraq thrown back at the West. Look at the chaos that the West produces when it's allowed to rampage across the world stage. And also now the 2020 election, those words, Putin's words there, talking directly to Trump and saying if the 2020 victory hadn't been stolen. I mean, yes, that's designed to cozy up to the Trump administration, but it's also there to underline to his own people, I would venture, that democracy is just chaos, and look at what it can result in. Much better just to stick with the strong man, you know. Fascinating stuff. Thanks, Francis. Any thoughts on that, folks? Please do let us know. It's not going to go anytime soon, so we do welcome your contribution to the debate. Shashank Yoshi, defence editor at The Economist, joined Francis for a debrief last week after the Chatham House event with the former Finnish president. In this critical moment of the war, they discussed the misalignment of European election timelines and its impact on the continent's unity, how talks of negotiations affect frontline morale, the conditions under which Putin might agree to a deal, and a potential pathway to lasting peace, one that doesn't rely on Western troops on the ground. This is their conversation.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast for the very first time. There's so much we could talk about. We're at Chatham House at the moment. You were on stage with the Finnish president. I wonder if you could just start by offering your reflections on what he said and where we are broadly in the war at the moment, specifically perhaps in the context of Trump and the European positions and how they've changed in the last few months.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's an honour to be on. Big fan of your show and really delighted we've got time for this. I thought his speeches was really interesting. This is a moment at which Europe is taking stock of 18 months of real hybrid action, right? Assassination threats, cable cutting, all manner of arson, skullduggery, explosive packages on planes. And you have Niinisto, this guy who has been at the apex of the country, which is the security-minded country in Europe, the most, the exemplar of resilience. How do you build security into new European legislation? How do you think more about a common European intelligence picture? The big question I always have from all of that is, that's easy for you to say, Finland, right? 80% of your country is up for defending itself. You have this incredibly cohesive society that has emerged out of this war with Russia, this nation-defining war with Russia. You have private sector where every executive is in uniform and knows how to fire a gun. That is not the UK. It is not Spain, it's not Portugal, it's not Belgium. So that challenge of exporting security culture from one country, that's always the big question mark I have over these kind of things.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting as well to hear him lament, shall we say, on his part, that Putin and Trump may speak over the heads of Europe. And I wanted to cry out and say, well, if you want to be taken seriously, you have to have a coherent defence posture. And clearly Europe has not been successful. I wonder if you could offer your perspective as somebody, of course, like we have, reporting on this war daily ever since it erupted in the full-scale invasion 3 years ago. Why is Europe now in a position, in your view, where it can be talked over by Russia and the United States?
Well, you're absolutely right on that. There was a great comment by Nikolai Patrushev, who is the former Secretary of Russia's National Security Council, a bit of a nut job, as you'll have seen some of the stuff he said. He's now an aide to Putin. And he basically said, we don't care about London and Brussels. We do not care about London and Brussels. We just care about Washington. The Europeans are not part of this conversation. So how did we get there? And the issue, I think, is not should Europeans speak to Putin or not, right? There was same criticism leveled at Macron when he spoke to Putin early in the conflict. It's what was being said and the position they came from. I think the same thing applies to Scholz and his conversations. It's not that we don't want the German Chancellor speaking to Putin. It's that maybe he lacks credibility as a very risk-averse leader who has not always been at the vanguard of providing aid or the vanguard of providing the key capabilities Ukraine needs to speak on these issues. But how did we get to this position? Fundamentally, we kicked the can down the road, right? We kicked the can down the road. Isn't that the story of this whole thing, right? If we had given Ukraine the capabilities we eventually ended up giving them in the summer or autumn of 2022, after the battle for Donbass, around the time of the battle for Kherson, the lightning offensive on Kharkiv, instead of waiting to build those multiple brigades and train those multiple brigades and hand over fighter jets and hand over F-16s and hand over main battle tanks, we would have been in a much stronger position. But more fundamentally than that, we have catastrophically failed on defense industry. And we have this terrible situation now where we haven't taken the actions we needed to take in 2022. Had we taken them then, we could have been in a position to supply Ukraine with all of the shells it needed. And instead, we're finding ourselves still utterly dependent on the Americans. The most depressing thing, I think, is that I still don't think that has completely changed.
Of course, Germany, of all the countries in Europe, had perhaps the procurement base that could have been expanded the quickest. We've got a German election coming up at the end of February. Many people will speculate that Olaf Scholz is going to lose that election and we're thereby going to end up in potentially a more hawkish Berlin. What do you think the ramifications of that are going to be for the war? Or do you think it really actually doesn't matter? It's too little too late?
Isn't it frustrating to think about the misalignment of European political timetables? I mean, can you just imagine hypothetically the alignment of a Boris Johnson-led UK with a post-Damascene conversion Emmanuel Macron and a Friedrich Merz in Germany sitting in office in 2022 or even early 2023, it could have been a very different constellation of forces shaping the debate. And instead we have this staggered change. You know, I'm not saying this government is weak on Ukraine, but I think it's the status quo is not up to where we find ourselves. It's an admirable level of commitment, 3 billion a year, existing levels, but that existing level isn't enough to keep Ukraine solvent in the field and defending itself. Similarly, with Merz, we could see some remarkable things. You know, he's promised to give the Taurus missile. I assume this is a podcast in which I don't need to define things like the Taurus missile to Ukraine if Russia continues to bomb civilians. But do we honestly think that's what's going to make the fundamental difference in 6 months' time? What we need, really, is Europeans now collectively having an offer on the table that says to Trump, we need you to stay involved, stay committed, underwrite Ukraine's security. We will do a deal and we will step up. But here's our offer on the table. If you stay involved, we can't do it without you as well. But I fear the German elections are going to come that little bit too late to be the decisive influence on those European conversations with the American government.
On the American government then, of course, there's lots of speculation at the moment about which direction Donald Trump may go into. And indeed, we could spend the rest of this time just talking about the various statements he's made in the last 48 hours. So let's not do that. But let's talk then about this prospect of talks. Do you think that these talks do actually have any ability to be meaningful at this moment, given the fact that it would appear that Putin thinks he's got momentum with him at the moment? Do you think this is political theatre at this moment?
No, I think it's more than theatre. I wouldn't go as far as the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, who I heard this morning say he thought the war would be concluded within 3 to 6 months, which profoundly surprised me. But I take Finnish leaders quite seriously when they say things. But at the same time, it's certainly not theatre. You asked, is it meaningful? And actually, we should think about that. It is consequential, right? The moment you begin diplomacy, this is going to have a knock-on effect inside Ukraine on the front lines. As some people have said to me, no one wants to be the last person dead on the front line. In the First World War, for instance, certain types of talks at the very end had to be kept very secret. I think thousands upon thousands of people died on the last day of the conflict. And if troops on the front line feel the war is going to be over, their deaths will be in vain, the level of desertions will rise significantly, particularly on the Ukrainian side, where the resort to coercion is far less. So that's a big problem.
And particularly in territory that may now be signed away as part of any negotiation.
Absolutely, exactly. Resistance activity may also have a knock-on effect, right? If you're a brave resistance fighter in occupied Zaporizhia or Kherson, do you risk your life to quite the same extent if you think the territory might be frozen and the war might be sewn up anytime now? So that's the kind of knock-on effect. It'll affect Zelensky's government. You know, his popularity has plummeted in many ways. If he's forced to make unpalatable concessions, he could face significant political headwinds at home. It could place incredible stresses on his government. But at the end of the day, I fear Ukraine's bargaining position is not strong. It is not strong right now. And if Trump is intent on imposing a weak deal backed by poor security guarantees, it is possible that Ukraine will feel compelled to pause, to buy time, to mobilize more people, to train, to move to the strategic defensive more forcefully, as many senior Ukrainians are talking about internally and privately, to more defensible positions. And they will do that in the anticipation there will be another big war in 3 or 4 years. But they may be pushed down that road regardless. So that's an absolute plausible outcome at this stage in time as a byproduct of these talks unleashed by Trump.
Do you think Putin, though, would sign a ceasefire, would sign a peace deal, or do you think he thinks that the wind is in his sails and that his position grows stronger over time?
I think there's 3 circumstances in which Putin might sign a deal. One of them is if he feels the alternative is a radicalized Trump who goes all in on Ukraine. I think that's unlikely, but I accept with Trump the range of possible outcomes is much higher than with many other leaders. And we've certainly seen him make some quite aggressive statements, including in recent days on what he's willing to do on tariffs. He's talked about trying to cause the oil price to plummet to undermine Russia's economy. Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, has talked about redoubling support for Ukraine. So that's scenario 1. Scenario 2 is if Putin gets everything he wants, right? If he says, signs away Ukraine's future on a plate. I, again, think that Trump himself may be willing to do this, but he doesn't want to be associated with a total collapse of Kiev. He doesn't want Kabul in Kiev. Not on his watch. Not least when
that's the big fear.
He sees that as such a failing of the Biden administration. He doesn't want that. And scenario 3, which I think is more likely of these other than any of these, is a scenario of a pause, a deal. And it has pretty weak guarantees, very weak guarantees. So there's no NATO commitment. There's no significant tripwire force in Ukraine. You know, there's just more of promise to supply more arms, maybe to consult in the event of aggression. In that scenario, given the economic and political stresses on Putin, I don't believe his underlying political objectives have changed, which are to ultimately subjugate Kiev and have a friendly Kiev and to break the European security order. However, I think he may be open to the timing of that. And if he thinks I have to wait for 3 years to rebuild my economy, wait for support for Ukraine to dissipate, keep Ukraine on its toes through post-Minsk type shelling and skirmishing, and then reinvade, that is a possibility as well. So those are all potential pathways by which Russia could still sign something that brings the guns to a relative lull.
It's interesting. Let's look at the prospect of peace settlement then, and this conversation around what Europe could provide in order to potentially protect Ukraine from some future invasion. It seems to me there's a lot of wishful thinking around this, given the size of Ukraine, of course, and how many troops would be required. I think yesterday at Davos, President Zelensky said that 200,000 troops from Europe would be the minimum to be meaningful in Ukraine. Some people would say that that's an overestimate.
So he's obviously not met the British Army.
Well, indeed. Well, this is it. So we had Lord Janet on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he said bluntly that the entire British Army could only defend 10% of the Ukrainian border at present. So this is serious. Now, we're not suggesting, of course, that a peace deal would have full armed forces all the way along the border, but nevertheless, it puts it starkly, doesn't it? So I wonder, what are the best case scenarios in your view, knowing Europe as it is and the inclinations of where we are, of how far is Europe, do you think, at this moment, willing to go for a settlement that involves a stop to the war?
I remember talking to an official from a Central and Eastern European country who was entertaining the prospect of troops in Ukraine. And I said, well, what do you propose? Where are we finding these forces from? We have a battle group in Estonia as Brits. We have a commitment to scale that up to a brigade. And we have other forces, but they're pretty thin. And he said, oh, you have the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, the ARC, which is part of, as you know, it's part of what NATO calls the Strategic Reserve Corps. It's the Supreme Allied Commanders, SACEUR's Strategic Reserve. And obviously, people know what a Strategic Reserve is, but if when the battle is going badly or when you need to sort of plug a hole, you send in your reserve, you hold it back. And I said, well, that's the reserve. What do you mean committed to Ukraine? And he said, oh, then you just build a new reserve. And I thought that is completely fantastical stuff. Now, what's realistic? I think a force in the rear in Ukraine, a kind of political tripwire that sits to the west of the Dnipro, sits maybe near urban conurbations, is multinational, involves the UK, France, Germany, and Central and Eastern Europe, is feasible if and only if it involves very significant degrees of enablement by the United States. That means a degree of air cover. It means filling gaps in areas we are all deficient, particularly theatre air defences, which are absolutely non-negotiable. Electronic warfare, for reasons that will be obvious to anyone who follows Ukraine. And logistics, right? The massive logistical burden of this. Germany is currently establishing a brigade in Lithuania. That is a big endeavour, right? It's costing billions. They're building barracks. They're building up this fresh infrastructure. This would cost billions and billions and billions, and you'd still have to backfill the capabilities. Now, are the Americans willing to provide air cover, air defence, EW, logistics, right? A divisional backup? I don't know. When I look at some of these appointments I'm seeing in the administration, when I look at the people like Bridge Colby, of course, the new Pentagon policy chief, some of the appointments in the Pentagon. These are not people who are wild about the idea of America engaging in a generational deployment to Eastern Europe. Absolutely not. Therefore, right now, I'm skeptical that we will see a significant European force inside Ukraine.
As am I. And I think that this is why it's interesting to be talking about it now, because there are so many people, it seems, that just think, oh yeah, there'll be a negotiation and it will mean that there'll be troops on the ground and it'll be probably small numbers and the United States will support it. But actually, when you look at the detail of this, and then there's the broader question, which is, does this count as a victory? This is something that can mean a long-lasting, stable Eastern front against Russia, and indeed that secures Ukraine's long-term sovereignty and security. I know you're saying that's the best case scenario in a sense. If we get to that point, do you see that as a success? Do you see that as being a pathway to long-term security in Europe? Or do you think that is just sowing the seeds for further chaos?
I think that would deter Russia from renewing a war of aggression. And Ukraine would live under the Russian shadow, but it would be able to rebuild with security. But there are only a few options on the table. One of them is no guarantees, which I think does mean a renewed invasion. One of them is very frothy guarantees, like we see in the existing bilateral commitments. The third is NATO membership. Not going to happen. Germany's against it. America's against it. Kellogg's against it. There's a lot of opposition. The fourth is a coalition of the willing providing equivalent Article 5 guarantees. I think that's quite unlikely. The fifth and final one is probably the one I think we need to spend a bit more time thinking about, which is previously has been called the Israel model, right? We arm them to the teeth. And Zelensky himself in his peace plan effectively has an element of this when he says, give us strategic weapons. And now we know, with the benefit of a little bit of time, that what he was talking about was Tomahawk, a very long-range cruise missile that is significantly longer range than anything Ukraine's been given so far. I wonder if that actually is the place we might land. And supplemented by Ukraine's own indigenous long-range strike systems, because the argument will be that is cheaper and safer than having to provide the guarantees ourselves or be in Ukraine ourselves. I'm not saying that's great or provides absolute security, and I certainly don't think that that gives you the outcome that you've articulated, which is a Ukraine that can say, that's done, we can now get on with rebuilding.
It's very interesting, isn't it? You mentioned there that a prospect of a Ukraine that is in itself armed to the teeth, to use your expression, and that may not require Europe to be as heavily involved in a future. I wonder whether you think that Ukraine's own society, its democratic resilience, for instance, would be strong enough to be battling the hybrid warfare you started with. Because there's another element to this, which is European security is threatened by a Russia that is perceived as succeeding in Ukraine. It has mobilised its hybrid operations to a degree that we're seeing it try to destabilise Moldova, we're seeing it try to destabilise Georgia with some success. So do you think Ukraine could sustain that? And do you think that indeed Europe could sustain that idea of a Russia that is allowed to recover and then wage a different kind of war in the East?
I think Ukraine now has quite a lot of experience at this, right? We saw at the beginning of the war significant concerns that Ukraine's domestic security service, the SBU, was deeply penetrated, riddled with Russians, and they did root out a lot of people, right? They did pull a lot of people out of their beds and stick them into jail, and that was a concern. But they have now 3 years of being hardened by not just conventional warfare at the front, in which in many ways they have incredible skill and expertise and innovation, but also by the hybrid side of things, right? They understand Russian information warfare, they understand some of the cyber aspects, they understand Russian efforts to sabotage Ukrainian supply chains. I think they get it. The bit which I think is much harder is not resisting this cyber attack or that information attack. It's the kind of political, societal resilience of any society this far into a conflict, right? You've been to Ukraine and you know Ukraine well, and you see it. You can see the opposition being more emboldened, less deferential to the government as it was in the early days of the war. You see soldiers on the front line in the brigades absolutely furious at parts of the Ministry of Defence and the General Staff, saying, we have to buy all of our own kit and all of our own electronic warfare jammers. What's going on? And I think in some ways civil-military relations in Ukraine is a bit more ropey than actually we sometimes recognize from the outside. So it's that worries me sometimes. You know, when societies are under this straitjacket of necessary martial law, and then they loosen and open up, it can be very discombobulating for them. And I suspect that actually there'd be some serious questions over whether Zelensky's government could survive in that context, and what would be the political ambitions of people like Valery Zaluzhny, the former commander-in-chief, the general who's now ambassador in London. I think, you'd see a lot of political jockeying going on in that kind of situation.
Yes, I suppose it depends indeed on what the peace would look like as to whether there would be a lot of angry soldiers in Ukraine.
Well, this is what Ukrainians always warn, right? They say, if you impose a bad peace on us, you risk a kind of mutinous, resentful Ukraine. And I was talking to a colleague about this, and I said, well, what do they mean by this? What do they think is the risk? What are they going to do? They're still going to be dependent on Western arms. And the answer was, well, sometimes they talk about shedding all the old restrictions on targeting. Right now we listen to you when you say don't hit this or don't hit that, but we will stop listening to you more and more. And there's kind of a little bit of a madman threat there, right? Who knows what will start hitting inside Russia if you cut us loose and abandon us in this way. There is also the risk, of course, of a breakdown of military order and brigades being more autonomous and more kind of internal competition amongst a lot of armed, angry men. I think that's quite an extreme situation. I think we shouldn't imply Ukraine's kind of bubbling on the edge of revolution.
It's not going to become the Weimar Republic.
Well, no, but in the case of a really bad deal in which it's been compromised, sold out, given up land, and it just doesn't have anything to show for it, any society, any polity is at risk of serious political instability.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much for that. I just wanted to end actually on a totally different subject of conversation, which is you are a defence editor at The Economist. Being in an editorial role, you are involved in commissioning pieces, you're involved in a lot of oversight. I wonder if you can just comment on how you, as a publication, of course we have our own approaches as well as a newspaper, but what have you been particularly proud of that The Economist has covered on this, and how has your approach been to the war? What have you sought to provide to the world in terms of covering this?
I have really tried to look at the granular innovation occurring. And the question I always ask people when I interview them is to say, what's new today that it wasn't the case 6 months ago, because you know how quickly things are changing on the military technology front, right? The software, the systems, the sensors coming on stream, they're changing every 6 weeks, if not quicker than that. And that's a challenge for us, right? You can't just write a drone piece and leave it there and then think, I've done my drone piece for the year. It's actually, you write a drone piece every month, because the object recognition algorithm inside this small Ukrainian airframe is quite different in reliability, in its engagement range, in its cost to what it was in the autumn last year. And so it imposes this rhythm on us that's different and fresh and new, and actually wouldn't have been the case if you were covering Afghanistan or Iraq, where of course there was innovation, MRAPs and armored vehicles for my counter-IED, but it was not quite at the same spectacular level of pace. The other thing I must say is I think that I'm very proud of the fact that editorially we've been very supportive of Ukraine, and we've shone a spotlight on Russia's war of aggression before the war, its preparations and afterwards. But I'm also very proud of the fact that we've asked difficult questions of the people we are ideologically sympathetic with as well. And we have asked very difficult questions of Ukrainian leaders, of Ukrainian society. My colleague Arkady Ostrovsky, who knows more about Ukraine has forgotten more about Ukraine than I'll ever know, wrote a fantastic piece for us on Odessa and the removal of Russian language monuments and Russian language in Odessa. It was a very controversial piece. A lot of Ukrainians didn't want to hear it. They didn't like it. They thought it was an outsider telling them something very arrogantly. I think it was a great piece, and a lot of Ukrainians were really appreciated it. And I think sometimes, as you know very well, you've absolutely got to be willing to write the pieces that make the people you like very uncomfortable, and that's something you always have to do, regardless of how it makes you feel.
Absolutely. Is there anything we haven't talked about that is on your mind?
Well, I'd say there's the absolutely huge question of the NATO summit coming up in the summer, because all of these questions around what happens in Ukraine and what the Europeans will do in Ukraine, these are kind of inseparable from the question of what the US-NATO relationship will be like. If we can persuade the Trump administration as Europeans that we have a credible offer on the table, that will also go a long way to binding America into NATO, as you could argue occurred in the first Trump term. If we fail to do that, these two things could go the same way. We could see a retrenchment of America, not just from Ukraine, but also from European security as a whole. I think the other big question we haven't addressed is the role of outside powers, particularly China. We heard today, I think, President Niinistö talk about the possibility of a Chinese role in any settlement. That's certainly something that's come up before. I think that this raises really big questions for us as Europeans. How do we feel about China, a country that is viewed as a systemic challenger in the EU, as an epoch-defining threat in our own strategy in the UK, basically plonking itself into the middle of a European war on the side of the country whose defense industry it enabled for 3 years? Is that a good thing because they will hold the Russians back? Is it a bad thing that will cement China's role on our doorstep? IISS, a think tank, just published a good piece showing how Chinese small arms exports are now dominating Africa, and will soon be penetrating the Sahel right on our southern Med doorstep. So I think we still have a bit of a superficial China debate in this country. Should Rachel Reeves go to China or not? Should she shake hands with the Chinese or not? When all the kind of deeper, substantive, difficult policy questions are bubbling and simmering away, and we should devote much more thought and attention to those.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now then, let's move on to final thoughts. For my final thoughts, I'd like to just raise this issue. It's occurred in the last 12 hours, or just over 12 hours. The Royal Navy's 7th Astute class hunter-killer submarine. So we're building 7 new attack submarines called the Astute class. The 7th boat is under construction at the moment. It's going to be named HMS Achilles. All good so far. Now, in 2018, the then Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson announced this boat, and he said it was going to be called HMS Agincourt. Right. Now, what's the reason for this apparent name change? Of course, Agincourt, referring to the 1415 battle that saw a much smaller English and Welsh army defeat a big French army, helped in no small part by the use of longbows. So my question here, do we now have to rename the longbow radar on our Apache gunships? Do we have to rename Type 23 frigate HMS Iron Duke, named after the Duke of Wellington, who was, I think the last time I looked, he was known for having duffed up a few Frenchies in his day. So HMS Achilles now was never formally named or commissioned before it's been sort of renamed today. So perhaps the old sailors' tradition of it being unlucky to rename naval vessels doesn't really apply. But my question is, does it matter? What do you think? Does it matter to have roughy-toughy names of ships, units, aircraft? Is it really that important? And on this, I very much welcome your thoughts. But on this, I should credit my friend and colleague Jerome Starkey at The Sun, who broke this story. It was his story. He's been working on it for some time, even though Britain's MOD erroneously pulled the rug from under his scoop by putting this news out in a late-night tweet last night, about 11 o'clock. Sunday night, MOD put this tweet out about the renaming, of course that being the traditional time to release defence news. But credit and hat tip there to Jerome Starkey at The Sun. But I'd welcome your thoughts on that, folks. Does it matter? Do names matter? Francis, any final thoughts, please?
Fun fact, I can't resist. Wellington isn't known as the Iron Duke because of his military prowess, but because there were iron shutters on his windows. He had to put them there because he was so unpopular as Prime Minister that people used to throw stones through his windows. Something that you could do, Dom, in the future. Might save you some expense.
Thanks for that, Francis. Now, I must just say that words that turn my blood cold is when you say, here's a fun fact for you. But anyway, never mind. Good stuff.
We'll see what the listeners think. Anyway, a couple of final thoughts today. The first thing just to flag is that we didn't talk about this last week, but the parliamentary leader of Zelensky's Servant of the People party was among the foreign dignitaries that attended Trump's inauguration last week. Now, that's noteworthy, I think, because if some of the most pessimistic reporting around the Republican Party were true, then I think he would not have been invited to attend alongside people like Boris Johnson, Giorgia Meloni, those who are seen as being more friendly towards the Trump administration. So just something to bear in mind. The other thing I just wanted to talk about is the extraordinary feedback we've had for Friday's episode, where we offered, and Dr. Jane McGlynn had compiled with her research assistant Ilya, an extraordinary summary of resistance in the occupied territories. So a new segment. And if you missed that, I do highly recommend that you check it out. The feedback, as I say, has been amazing, and we will continue to make sure that is, as was always planned, a very regular segment. Jade will be back later this week to report on the latest that's taken place. And just lastly, a word of thanks for all of those who've written in just to say how much you appreciated the segment on Friday with Dr. Jade McGlynn, where she summarised in our new regular segment the resistance activities in the occupied territories. If you missed that, highly recommend listening to it on Friday's episode. Offers, I think, a perspective that is vastly underreported and totally changes how one thinks about the occupied territories, because there is a lot of resistance activity that's taking place there, and she goes into detail in describing many of those in the last few weeks. And we also heard your points that you'd like to also hear about non-violent acts of resistance too. So we've taken that feedback on board. But just a note to say thank you, and if you missed it, do check out Friday's episode.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, We're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.